Lisa had been dreaming about owning a ranch for as long as she could remember. Growing up in a tiny apartment in the city, she used to stare out her bedroom window at the concrete buildings and imagine wide open spaces where she could breathe freely. Her childhood was filled with books about cowboys and horses, and she promised herself that one day she'd have her own piece of land. After 3 years of searching every weekend, driving down dusty back roads and calling real estate agents who specialized in rural properties, Lisa was starting to lose hope. The prices kept going up and everything decent was either too small or too expensive. She had saved every penny from her job at the insurance company, living on ramen noodles and generic cereal just to build up enough for a down payment. Then one Friday afternoon, her phone rang. It was Janet, the real estate agent who had been helping her search. Janet's voice was excited in a way Lisa had never heard before. "Lisa, I think I found it. The perfect property just came on the market this morning. 40 acres, a farmhouse that needs some work, and get this, it has a natural pond. The owner needs to sell fast because he's moving out of state for a family emergency." Lisa's heart started pounding. "What's the catch? Properties like that usually cost way more than I can afford." "That's just it," Janet said. "He's priced it to sell quickly. It's about 30,000 less than anything comparable we've looked at, but you'll need to move fast. I've already got 3 other buyers asking about it." Lisa didn't even wait until Saturday. She called in sick to work and met Janet at the property that same afternoon. The moment she turned down the gravel driveway, she knew this was it. The old farmhouse sat on a small hill, painted white but showing its age with peeling spots here and there. The front porch sagged a little, but it had character. Real character, not the fake kind they put on new houses trying to look old. But what really took her breath away was the land itself. Rolling green pastures stretched out in every direction, dotted with massive oak trees that must have been growing there for decades. The grass was thick and healthy, the kind that comes from years of good care. She could see why the previous owner had run cattle here. This was prime grazing land. The house was built in 1952, Janet explained as they walked toward the front door. The original owner raised 5 kids here and ran about 200 head of cattle. When he retired, he sold to the current owner, who's kept it in great shape but doesn't have livestock anymore. The inside of the house was simple but solid. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, and a kitchen that looked like it belonged in a country magazine. The wooden floors creaked a little when you walked on them, but they were the real thing, not fake wood flooring. The windows were old but well maintained, and every single one looked out onto beautiful views of the property. "Where's the pond?" Lisa asked, trying not to sound too eager. "Oh, that's the best part," Janet grinned. "Come on, I'll show you." They walked out the back door and across a pasture that sloped gently downward. Lisa could hear water before she could see it. Then, as they crested a small rise, there it was. The pond was bigger than she had imagined, maybe an acre across, surrounded by cattails and a few old willow trees. The water was clear enough that she could see fish swimming near the surface. A great blue heron stood perfectly still in the shallow water on the far side, waiting for an unwary fish to swim too close. "The previous owner told me it's fed by a seasonal creek and rainwater runoff," Janet explained. "It's never gone dry, even during the worst drought years. The water level goes up and down with the seasons, but it stays full year-round." Lisa stood there for a long moment, just taking it all in. The pond reflected the afternoon sky like a perfect mirror. She could already picture herself sitting here in the evenings after work, maybe with a fishing pole watching the sun go down. This was exactly what she'd been dreaming about for so many years. "The barn needs some work," Janet continued, pointing to an old red building near the house. "But the bones are good. The previous owner used it mainly for hay storage and equipment. The fencing is in great shape, too. If you ever wanted to get into cattle or horses, this place is ready for it." Lisa walked over to examine the barn. The paint was faded and peeling, and a few boards needed replacing, but Janet was right about the structure being solid. She could see herself fixing it up over the weekends, maybe painting it that classic barn red color. The fencing looked newer, probably replaced within the last 10 years. "What's the story with the land around here?" Lisa asked. "Any development plans I should know about?" Janet shrugged. "This whole area is zoned agricultural. Your neighbors are all cattle ranchers or people who just want space and privacy. There's been some talk about development further south, but nothing concrete. This area has been farming and ranching country for generations." As they walked back toward the house, Lisa tried not to let her excitement show too much. She'd learned from all her failed attempts at buying property. that you never let the seller know how much you want something. But inside, she was already planning where she'd plant a vegetable garden and which room would be her home office. The paperwork was surprisingly straightforward. The owner really did need to sell fast due to a family situation, and he'd priced the property to move quickly. Lisa's pre-approval letter was solid, and her down payment was ready to transfer. Within 2 weeks, she'd made an offer, negotiated some minor repairs, and scheduled the closing. The day she got the keys was one of the happiest of her life. She drove out to the property alone just to walk around and let it sink in that this was really hers now. She had her own 40 acres of Texas countryside, complete with that beautiful pond and all the peace and quiet she'd dreamed about. She spent that first evening sitting by the pond, watching the sun set behind the oak trees. The water was perfectly still, and she could hear cattle lowing in the distance from a neighboring ranch. A few fireflies started blinking in the grass around her feet. For the first time in years, Lisa felt completely at peace. The nearest neighbor was about a quarter mile away, and she'd waved at the elderly man who lived there when she drove past his mailbox. He'd waved back from his front porch, and she made a mental note to introduce herself properly once she got settled in. Lisa had big plans for the property. She wanted to stock the pond with bass and maybe some catfish for fishing. She thought about getting a few horses eventually, once she got comfortable with ranch life. The vegetable garden would have to wait until spring, but she could start planning it over the winter. As she sat there in the gathering darkness, listening to the sounds of the countryside around her, Lisa couldn't help but smile. After years of searching and saving and dreaming, she'd finally found her perfect place. She had no idea that within 6 months, her peaceful slice of paradise would become the center of a neighborhood dispute that would test every bit of patience she had. 6 months after Lisa settled into her dream ranch, she woke up one Monday morning to the sound of diesel engines rumbling in the distance. At first, she thought it might be her neighbor fixing something on his property. But when the noise continued for hours, she decided to investigate. She made herself a cup of coffee and walked out to the eastern edge of her property, where the sound seemed to be coming from. What she saw made her stomach drop. 3 large bulldozers were clearing trees on the 20-acre plot next to her land. The property had been thick with native mesquite and oak trees, home to deer, rabbits, and countless birds. Now it looked like a war zone, with tree stumps scattered everywhere and heavy machinery crawling over the torn-up earth. Lisa had noticed the for sale sign on that land when she first looked at her ranch, but she'd assumed it would sell to another rancher or someone who wanted their own rural getaway. She never imagined someone would develop it. A man in a hard hat was standing near the road, talking on his cell phone and pointing at different areas of the cleared land. Lisa walked over to the fence line that separated her property from the chaos. "Excuse me," she called out. "What's going in here?" The man looked up from his phone call and walked over. "Morning. New subdivision called Meadowbrook Estates. Gonna be real nice. 20 luxury homes on 1-acre lots. Should be finished by next spring." Lisa felt like someone had punched her in the gut. 20 houses? Right next to her peaceful ranch? "Luxury homes?" she managed to ask. "Oh yeah, these are going to be top of the line, starting at $400,000 and going up from there. City folks who want to live in the country but still have all the modern conveniences. Each house is going to be at least 3,000 square feet and most will have swimming pools." Lisa thanked the man and walked back to her house in a daze. She sat on her front porch looking out at her beautiful land and tried to process what this meant. 20 large houses, which probably meant 40 or 50 new neighbors, all within a few hundred yards of her quiet ranch. Over the next few weeks, the construction activity ramped up dramatically. Survey crews marked out the individual lots with bright orange flags. Concrete trucks rumbled down the previously quiet country road, shaking Lisa's house as they passed. The peaceful mornings she'd grown to love were now filled with the sounds of hammering, power tools, and shouting construction workers. The worst part was watching what they did to the natural landscape. The developers didn't just clear trees where the houses would go. They leveled everything, creating a blank slate that they could reshape however they wanted. They brought in tons of different dirt and laid it out in perfect geometric patterns. They installed a system of concrete drainage pipes and covered them with the imported soil. Lisa tried to stay positive. Maybe the new neighbors would appreciate country living and respect the rural character of the area. Maybe they'd be quiet people who just wanted space and privacy like she did. The first houses went up faster than she expected. These weren't the kind of homes that took months to build. The developers used prefabricated sections and assembly line techniques that had the frames up in just a few days each. By late summer, half the lots had houses in various stages of construction. Lisa got her first real look at what kind of neighborhood this was going to be when she drove past the model home they'd set up near the main entrance. The sign out front was elaborate with fancy lettering and professional landscaping. It advertised Meadowbrook Estates, where country elegance meets modern luxury. The model home was enormous, a two-story colonial style that looked like it belonged in an upscale suburban development, not in rural ranch country. The brochure she picked up from the sales office was full of pictures of families in expensive clothes, enjoying their country lifestyle while living in what were essentially suburban houses on slightly larger lots. What really caught her attention was one particular line in the marketing materials. Enjoy stunning views of natural water. Features an authentic ranch country from your own private deck. They were advertising her pond as an amenity for their buyers. The first families started moving in during early fall. Lisa watched from her property as moving trucks brought in furniture that looked like it came from expensive showrooms. The new residents drove luxury SUVs and imported cars that had never seen a dirt road before they moved to Meadowbrook Estates. She tried to be neighborly. When she saw a woman unpacking boxes in the backyard of the house closest to her property, Lisa walked over to the fence line and introduced herself. "Hi there. I'm Lisa. I live on the ranch next door. Welcome to the neighborhood." The woman looked up from her unpacking with a surprised expression, like she hadn't expected to have a neighbor so close by. "Oh, hello. I'm Patricia. We just moved in yesterday." Patricia's tone was polite but not particularly warm. She was wearing designer jeans and a spotless white blouse, not exactly ranch attire. "If you need anything or have questions about the area, just let me know," Lisa offered. "I've been here about 6 months now." "Actually," Patricia said, looking around Lisa's property, "I do have one question. Do you take care of that pond over there? It's such a beautiful view from our deck." Lisa felt a little uncomfortable with the way Patricia talked about her pond like it was community property. "It's on my land, so yes, I maintain it. It's been here for decades, fed by natural runoff." Patricia nodded absently, already looking distracted by her unpacking. "Well, it certainly adds to the property value." The real estate agent mentioned the water views when we were looking at houses. That evening, Lisa sat on her back porch and looked out at the lights beginning to come on in the new houses. She could hear the sounds of suburban life drifting across the pasture. Children playing in backyards, lawnmowers running on grass that had been planted just weeks ago, and the distinctive whir of central air conditioning units working overtime in the Texas heat. More families moved in each week. Lisa began to notice patterns in her new neighbors. They were mostly young professionals, people who worked in the city but wanted more space than a traditional suburban home could offer. They had small children who weren't used to country sounds and were sometimes frightened by the coyotes howling at night or the great horned owls calling from the oak trees. The transformation of the landscape was striking. Where there had once been natural grassland and scattered trees, there were now perfect green lawns that needed constant watering and fertilizing to stay alive in the climate. Each house had elaborate landscaping with plants that weren't native to the area, which meant even more water and maintenance. Lisa started noticing that some of her new neighbors had built their decks and patios specifically to face her pond. Several had invested in expensive outdoor furniture positioned to take advantage of the water view. She'd seen real estate listings online where people already trying to sell their new homes advertised the pond view as a major selling point. What bothered her most was the way they seemed to assume the pond was there for their enjoyment. She'd caught children throwing rocks into the water and families having picnics on what they apparently thought was community property, but was actually her private land. When she politely asked them to stay on their own side of the property line, they seemed genuinely surprised that the pond wasn't part of some kind of shared open space. By winter, all 20 houses were occupied, and Lisa was beginning to understand that her quiet country life was over. The road that had once seen maybe a dozen vehicles per day now had constant traffic as residents commuted to and from their city jobs. Her mailbox, which sat near the road, was surrounded by a cluster of identical suburban-style mailboxes that the HOA had required all residents to install. The final sign that everything had changed came in December, when Lisa received a thick envelope in the mail from something called the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. Inside was a letter explaining that the HOA had officially formed and was now working to maintain property values and community standards for all residents in the ITO area. The letter was signed by someone named Robert Chen, who had been elected as the first HOA president. Lisa had never met him, but apparently he lived in one of the houses that backed up to her property. The letter included a copy of the HOA's covenants, conditions, and restrictions, a book that was nearly 50 pages long and covered everything from acceptable paint colors to rules about parking and landscaping. Lisa flipped through the document with growing amazement. There were rules about what kind of mailboxes people could have, what colors they could paint their houses, how tall their grass could grow, and even what kind of decorations they could put in their yards during holidays. At the very end of the letter was a paragraph that made Lisa's blood run cold. The HOA is committed to working with all property owners in the area to maintain the high standards and property values that make Meadowbrook Estates such a desirable community. We look forward to collaborating with neighboring landowners to address any issues that might impact our residents' quality of life. Lisa set the letter down and looked out her kitchen window at the lights of Meadowbrook Estates. She had a sinking feeling that her troubles with her new neighbors were just beginning. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in January, delivered by certified mail. Lisa had to sign for it, which immediately made her nervous. The return address showed Meadowbrook Estates HOA in fancy lettering, and the envelope felt thick and official. Lisa poured herself a cup of coffee before opening it. The letter was printed on expensive letterhead and written in formal, legal-sounding language. It started politely enough, thanking her for being a valued neighbor and expressing appreciation for the rustic character her property brought to the area. Then it got to the point. The letter explained that several residents had expressed concerns about the visual impact of her barn and suggested that a fresh coat of paint would help maintain property values for the entire neighborhood. They offered to provide color recommendations that would complement the architectural vision of Meadowbrook Estates. Lisa read the letter twice, trying to make sure she understood correctly. Her neighbors wanted her to paint her barn to match their HOA standards, the barn that sat on her own property, that she owned free and clear. She walked outside and looked at the barn with fresh eyes. Yes, the red paint was faded and peeling in places. The building was nearly 70 years old and looked it. But it was solid, functional, and had been there decades before the first Meadowbrook Estates house was even planned. Lisa folded the letter and put it in her kitchen drawer. She had no legal obligation to respond to an HOA that didn't govern her property, and she wasn't about to spend her own money to satisfy neighbors who had moved in next to a working ranch and then complained about how it looked. 2 weeks later, another certified letter arrived. This one was less polite. It mentioned ongoing aesthetic concerns and specifically requested that she consider painting not just the barn, but her farmhouse as well. The letter included a color palette card with various shades of beige and cream, along with a note explaining that these colors had been carefully selected by our architectural committee to maintain visual harmony throughout our community. Lisa looked from the color card to her white farmhouse, with its cheerful blue shutters. Her house wasn't fancy, but it was clean and well-maintained. More importantly, it was hers, and she liked it exactly the way it was. This time she didn't put the letter in the drawer. She wrote a polite but firm response explaining that her property wasn't part of Meadowbrook Estates and wasn't subject to HOA regulations. She thanked them for their suggestions but made it clear she had no intention of changing her house or barn to suit their preferences. The third letter came from a law firm. Lisa's hands actually shook a little as she opened it. The legal language was intimidating, full of phrases about community standards and property value protection. But when she read it carefully, she realized it was mostly bluster. They couldn't actually force her to do anything because her property wasn't part of their HOA. Still, the message was clear. Her neighbors weren't giving up. Things escalated in February when Lisa came home from work to find a county code enforcement officer walking around her property with a clipboard. The man introduced himself as Dave Martinez and explained that he'd received several complaints about various code violations. "What kind of violations?" Lisa asked, trying to keep her voice calm. Dave looked uncomfortable. Well, I've got to investigate every complaint, but honestly, I don't see any real problems here. Someone complained that your gravel driveway is creating dust, but you're on agricultural land, so gravel is perfectly acceptable. Another complaint was about your barn being a safety hazard, but I can see it's structurally sound. Who made these complaints? Lisa asked, though she had a pretty good idea. I can't tell you specific names, but they all came from residents of Meadowbrook Estates. Look, between you and me, you're not violating any county codes. Your property is properly zoned agricultural, and everything here is legal. But the complaints are official, so I have to document my findings. Dave spent another hour walking around Lisa's property, taking pictures and making notes. He seemed genuinely sorry to be bothering her. When he left, he assured her that his report would show no violations, but warned her that the complaints would probably continue. He was right. Over the next month, Lisa dealt with visits from the fire marshal. Someone had reported her barn as a fire hazard. The health department, complaints about the pond being a breeding ground for mosquitoes, and even the sheriff's department, a report that she was operating an illegal business because she occasionally helped her elderly neighbor with farm chores in exchange for fresh eggs. Every single inspection came back clean. Lisa's property was in full compliance with all local regulations. But the visits were time-consuming and stressful, and she started to understand that this was probably the point. Her neighbors were trying to make owning her ranch so difficult that she'd eventually give up and move. The situation got worse in March when the weather warmed up and people started spending more time outside. Lisa began to notice Meadowbrook residents walking on her property as if it were a public park. Children would climb through the fence to get closer to the pond, and adults would set up folding chairs on her land to enjoy the water view they'd been promised when they bought their houses. The first few times, Lisa politely asked them to stay on their own side of the property line. Most apologized and moved, though she could see they were confused about why she was being so possessive of open space. But some got defensive, arguing that they weren't hurting anything and the pond was natural, as if that somehow made it community property. One Sunday afternoon in April, Lisa came home from grocery shopping to find an entire family having a barbecue on her property. They'd brought a portable grill, folding tables and coolers full of food. Their children were throwing bread to the fish in her pond, while the adults sat in lawn chairs drinking beer. "Excuse me," Lisa called out as she walked toward them. "This is private property. You can't have a party here." The man who appeared to be the father looked up with an annoyed expression. "We're not hurting anything. The kids just wanted to feed the fish. I understand, but this is my land. There are liability issues if someone gets hurt. I need to ask you to move back to your own property." The man's wife joined the conversation. "Are you the person who owns that old barn?" "We've been meaning to introduce ourselves. I'm Kelly, and this is my husband, Mike. We live in the blue house with the stone accents." Lisa recognized them as the family who had built the largest deck, positioned specifically to overlook her pond. "I'm Lisa. I appreciate you wanting to enjoy the outdoors, but you really can't set up on my property without permission." Kelly's friendly demeanor evaporated. "Look, we paid good money for a house with water views. The real estate agent specifically mentioned access to natural amenities. We're not hurting your precious pond." "There's no access involved," Lisa said firmly. "The pond is on my private property, just like your house is on your private property. You can look at it from your deck, but you can't use it." Mike stood up from his lawn chair. "This is ridiculous. It's just a pond. Nobody owns nature." Lisa felt her patience wearing thin. "Actually, I do own it. I have a deed that shows exactly where my property lines are. You're welcome to check with the county if you want to verify that." The family packed up their barbecue with a lot of dramatic sighing and muttered complaints about unfriendly neighbors. As they carried their gear back toward Meadowbrook Estates, Lisa heard Kelly tell her children that some people were just selfish and didn't understand about community spirit. That evening, Lisa installed no trespassing signs along the fence line between her property and the subdivision. They were small and discreet, but clearly visible. She hoped that would solve the problem. But she had a feeling it would just make her neighbors more resentful. She was right. The next week brought a new wave of certified letters, this time complaining about the unfriendly and unwelcoming attitude her signs represented. One letter accused her of trying to monopolize natural resources that should be shared with the community. Another suggested that her hostile behavior was negatively affecting everyone's property values. The most ridiculous complaint came from someone who objected to the sounds coming from her property. Apparently, the barn owls that nested in her oak trees were disruptive to family sleep schedules, and the coyotes that occasionally passed through her land were frightening to small children. Lisa sat in her kitchen one evening in May, looking through the stack of letters and official complaints that had accumulated over the past few months. She'd done nothing wrong. Her property was legal, well-maintained, and in full compliance with all regulations. But her neighbors seemed determined to make her life miserable until she gave in to their demands. She looked out her window at the lights of Meadowbrook Estates and made a decision. If her neighbors wanted to play hardball, she was ready to play. But first, she needed to make a phone call to her old friend Miguel, who ran a cattle operation about an hour south of town. Miguel owed her a big favor from a few years back, and she was finally ready to collect on it. If the people of Meadowbrook Estates wanted authentic ranch country living, Lisa was about to give them exactly what they'd asked for. Lisa stared at the latest certified letter from the Meadowbrook Estates HOA, and this one was different from all the others. Instead of complaints about her barn or suggestions for paint colors, this letter contained what they called a community petition, signed by 47 residents demanding immediate action about her pond. According to the petition, her pond was creating unsanitary conditions that were breeding mosquitoes and attracting undesirable wildlife that threatened the safety and property values of Meadowbrook Estates. The letter demanded that she remediate the water feature to bring it into compliance with community health standards. Lisa read the petition twice, her anger building with each ridiculous demand. These people had moved next to a working ranch and were now trying to force her to change a natural pond that had been there for decades, before their subdivision even existed. The final straw was a handwritten note attached to the petition from someone named Robert Chen, who identified himself as the HOA president. The note explained that if Lisa didn't take voluntary action to address their concerns within 30 days, the HOA would be forced to explore legal remedies to protect our community investment. Lisa set the letter down and walked out to her pond. It was a beautiful evening in late May, with the setting sun reflecting off the calm water. A great blue heron stood motionless in the shallows, and she could see bass jumping for insects near the surface. This was exactly what she'd dreamed about when she bought the property. A peaceful place where she could enjoy nature without bothering anyone. But apparently, enjoying nature on her own property was bothering someone. Her 47 someones to be exact. Lisa pulled out her cell phone and dialed a number she knew by heart. Miguel Santos had been her friend since college, and he now ran one of the largest cattle operations in the county, about 60 miles south of her ranch. More importantly, Miguel owed her a huge favor. 3 years earlier, when Miguel was going through a nasty divorce, Lisa had lent him the money to keep his ranch when his ex-wife tried to force a sale. She'd never asked for anything in return, but Miguel had repeatedly told her that if she ever needed help with anything, all she had to do was call. "Miguel, it's Lisa. Remember when you said if I ever needed a favor, I should call you?" "Of course, mija. What do you need?" Lisa explained her situation with the HOA and their demands about her pond. Miguel listened without interrupting, occasionally making disgusted noises when she described particularly outrageous complaints. "So these city people moved next to your ranch, and now they want you to get rid of your pond?" Miguel asked when she finished. "They want me to remediate it, whatever that means. I think they want it to look like a suburban water feature instead of a natural farm pond." Miguel was quiet for a moment. "You know, Lisa, I think I can help you with this. But are you sure you want to go nuclear? Because what I'm thinking will definitely solve your problem. But there's no going back once we do it." "What did you have in mind?" "Well, you've got 40 acres of good pasture land, and your property is still zoned agricultural, right? I've got more cattle than I can properly rotate on my current land. What if I moved about 150 head up to your place for the summer? You could lease the grazing rights, make some money, and give your new neighbors a real taste of ranch life." Lisa felt a smile spreading across her face. "That's brilliant. But won't it be a lot of work to transport that many cattle?" "Leave that to me. I've got the trucks and the experience. The only thing you'd need to do is make sure your fencing is solid and maybe install a gate or two. I can have everything ready to go in about 2 weeks. Miguel, you're a genius. But I have one more request. Do you have any older bulls in the herd? The kind that aren't shy about making their presence known? Miguel laughed. Oh, I see where this is going. Yeah, I've got a few bulls that like to announce themselves. Big old boys that aren't afraid of anything. And Lisa? I might throw in a few horses too. I've got some older ones that could use a change of scenery. They're not pretty, but they're healthy. And they definitely add to the authentic ranch experience. Perfect. Send me a quote for the fence work and gate installation. I want everything done legally and properly. The next morning, Lisa called the county zoning office to make sure she understood all the regulations. As she'd expected, her agricultural zoning allowed her to keep any number of livestock as long as she met basic health and safety requirements. She also called her insurance company to make sure her liability coverage was adequate. Within a week, a crew was upgrading her fencing and installing a heavy-duty cattle gate near the road. Lisa took great pleasure in the concerned look she got from Meadowbrook residents as they drove past the construction activity. Several neighbors stopped to ask what she was doing, and she politely explained that she was upgrading her facilities to accommodate livestock. What kind of livestock? Asked Patricia, the first neighbor she'd met when the subdivision was being built. Cattle and horses, Lisa replied casually. I'm leasing grazing rights to a friend who needs more pasture land. Patricia's face went pale. How many cattle? About 150 head plus some horses. Don't worry, they'll be properly contained. Lisa watched Patricia hurry back to her house, cell phone already pressed to her ear. Within an hour, Lisa's phone was ringing with calls from various Meadowbrook residents, all wanting to discuss her livestock plans. She politely explained to each caller that she was operating a legitimate agricultural business on properly zoned land, and that all activities would be in full compliance with county regulations. The fence upgrades were completed on a Thursday, and Miguel arrived the following Saturday with the first load of cattle. Lisa had never seen anything quite like the operation Miguel ran. The cattle trucks were enormous, and the cattle themselves were impressive specimens. Most were mixed breeds, sturdy animals that looked like they'd been born to live outdoors. But the real stars of the show were the bulls. Miguel had brought 3 of them, and they were magnificent. The largest was a massive red Angus named Toro, who weighed at least 2,000 pounds and had an attitude to match his size. He stepped off the truck like he owned the place, surveyed his new territory, and let out a bellow that could probably be heard for miles. That's Toro, Miguel explained with obvious pride. He's the king of any pasture he's in. These other 2 are Brutus and Tank. They're all getting older, so they're not breeding anymore, but they still like to remind everyone who's boss. The cattle spread out across Lisa's pastures like they'd been living there all their lives. Within a few hours, they'd established their favorite spots and settled into their routines. And their favorite spot, as Lisa had hoped, was the pond. The transformation was immediate and dramatic. What had been a pristine reflection pool surrounded by carefully maintained natural landscaping became exactly what it had always been meant to be: a working farm pond. The cattle waded in to drink and cool off, stirring up the bottom and turning the crystal-clear water a rich brown color. Miguel brought the horses on Sunday, and they were perfect for Lisa's purposes. They weren't pretty animals. Most were older with some scars and imperfections that showed they'd lived real lives. But they were healthy and well cared for, and they immediately made themselves at home in the pastures closest to Meadowbrook Estates. By Monday morning, the change in the ecosystem around Lisa's pond was complete. The cattle had churned the banks into mud, and the horses had added their own contributions to the landscape. The pristine water views that Meadowbrook residents had paid premium prices for now featured murky brown water and the unmistakable sights and smells of authentic ranch life. Lisa's phone started, ringing before 7 in the morning. The first call was from Patricia, whose voice was tight with barely controlled anger. Lisa, what have you done? I can't even open my windows because of the smell. I'm sorry you're having trouble, Patricia. I'm running a cattle operation now. It's all legal and properly permitted, but the pond, it's completely ruined. It looks like chocolate milk. Actually, it looks like a working farm pond, which is what it's always been. The previous owner ran cattle here for decades. The calls continued all day. Robert Chen, the HOA president, left a voicemail threatening legal action. Several other residents called to complain about flies, smells, and noise. One woman actually cried on the phone. explaining that she'd paid extra for her lot specifically because of the pristine water views. Lisa listened patiently to each complaint, explained that she was operating within her legal rights, and offered her sincere regrets that they were unhappy with authentic ranch life. Then she hung up and looked out her kitchen window at her beautiful cattle, peacefully grazing in the evening light. The next morning brought the most satisfying sight Lisa had experienced in months. Toro, the massive red bull, was standing knee-deep in the pond, drinking his morning water while the sun rose behind him. His reflection in the muddy water looked like something from a classic Western movie. From her kitchen window, Lisa could see several Meadowbrook residents standing on their decks in their bathrobes, staring in apparent horror at their new reality. She raised her coffee cup in a friendly toast to her neighbors and went outside to check on her beautiful, smelly, authentically ranchy livestock. The transformation was immediate and absolutely perfect. Within 24 hours of the livestock arriving, Lisa's pristine pond had become exactly what nature intended it to be: a muddy, aromatic, authentic ranch watering hole. The cattle, led by the magnificent Toro, had claimed the pond as their personal spa. They waded in during the heat of the day to cool off, stirred up the bottom with their hooves, and used it as their primary bathroom facility. The horses weren't far behind, adding their own distinctive contributions to the ecosystem. What had once reflected the sky like a mirror now looked like chocolate milk with floating debris. But the real beauty of Lisa's solution became apparent when the wind shifted. The carefully manicured backyards of Meadowbrook Estates, with their expensive outdoor furniture and professionally designed landscaping, were now downwind from a fully operational cattle operation. The rich, earthy aroma of authentic ranch life settled over the subdivision like a thick blanket. Lisa stood on her back porch Tuesday morning, drinking her coffee and watching her neighbors discover their new reality. Through the trees, she could see people hurrying back inside their houses after stepping onto their decks. One man tried to grill breakfast on his patio but gave up after 5 minutes, carrying his food back indoors while holding his shirt over his nose. The phone calls started early and continued all day. Patricia was the first to call, and she was no longer trying to be polite. "Lisa, this is unbearable. The smell is so strong I can't have my windows open. My children can't play outside. You have to do something about this." "I'm sorry you're uncomfortable, Patricia," Lisa replied calmly, "but I'm running a legitimate agricultural operation on agricultural land. This is what ranch life actually smells like. But this isn't what we signed up for. We bought here for country living, not this." Lisa almost laughed at the irony. "This is country living, Patricia. This is exactly what country living is. You just thought it would be the sanitized Hollywood version." Robert Chen, the HOA president, called an hour later with barely controlled rage in his voice. "Lisa, this situation is completely unacceptable. My wife can't even hang laundry outside anymore. The property values in our entire community are being destroyed. Robert, I understand you're upset, but everything I'm doing is completely legal. My property is zoned agricultural, I have all the proper permits, and I'm following all county regulations." "We'll see about that," Robert snapped. "We're calling every government agency we can think of. There has to be something illegal about what you're doing." "Feel free to call anyone you want," Lisa said pleasantly. "I'm confident that everything will check out fine." And it did. Over the next week, Lisa received visits from the same county inspectors who had been there before, plus a few new ones. The health department came to check for sanitation violations. The zoning office sent someone to verify her agricultural permits. The fire department investigated claims that the cattle were creating fire hazards. Even the state environmental agency sent an inspector after someone claimed she was polluting local water supplies. Every single inspection came back clean. Lisa was operating a textbook agricultural business in full compliance with all regulations. The inspectors were actually impressed with how well-maintained her operation was and how healthy her animals looked. The best part was watching the Meadowbrook residents deal with their new reality. The families who had installed expensive outdoor kitchens discovered that grilling dinner was no longer pleasant when the wind was blowing from the wrong direction. The children who had been frightened by owl sounds at night now had to cope with Toro's impressive morning bellows, which could wake people 3 miles away. Several residents tried creative solutions to their problem. One family installed an elaborate air filtration system that cost more than Lisa's entire annual ranch operating budget. Another tried to plant a wall of fast-growing trees between their property and Lisa's. But the young saplings weren't going to provide meaningful odor protection for several years. The real entertainment came from watching people try to maintain their suburban lifestyle while living next to a working cattle operation. Lisa watched one woman attempt to host a backyard birthday party for her daughter, complete with a bouncy castle and catered food. The party lasted exactly 45 minutes before the parents packed up and moved the celebration indoors. By the third week, the complaints to Lisa had stopped completely, but she could see increased activity around the real estate signs. 3 houses in Meadowbrook Estates went up for sale within days of each other. The online listings were creative in their descriptions, trying to emphasize positive aspects while avoiding any mention of nearby agricultural operations. Listing described a home with rustic country charm and authentic rural ambiance. Another advertised peaceful country, living with natural water views, though the photos were carefully cropped to avoid showing what the water actually looked like now. Lisa's favorite listing claimed the property offered an immersive agricultural experience and direct exposure to traditional farming operations. She had to admire the real estate agent's creativity in trying to spin the situation positively. The turning point came on a hot Thursday afternoon in June when Robert Chen showed up at Lisa's front door. He looked exhausted and defeated, like a man who had finally accepted that he wasn't going to win this particular battle. "Lisa, I'd like to talk to you about a possible solution to our situation." "Of course, Robert. Come on up to the porch where it's shady." Robert sat down heavily in one of Lisa's old wooden chairs and stared out at the cattle grazing peacefully in the pasture. "I'll cut to the chase. Several families are planning to move and property values have dropped significantly. We're prepared to make you a financial offer to relocate your livestock operation." Lisa poured herself a glass of iced tea and took her time responding. "That's an interesting offer, Robert. But I'm curious, what kind of offer are we talking about?" "We've taken up a collection among the residents. We're prepared to offer you $50,000 to move the cattle somewhere else and restore the pond to its previous condition." Lisa nearly choked on her tea. $50,000? For moving cattle that weren't costing her anything to keep there? "Robert, that's very generous, but I'm afraid I can't accept. You see, this livestock operation is my dream come true. I've wanted to be a real rancher my whole life, and now I finally am. Plus, the grazing lease is quite profitable for me." Robert's shoulders sagged. "What if we doubled the offer? $100,000? Lisa pretended to consider this seriously. "Robert, there isn't enough money in the world to make me give up this lifestyle. I wake up every morning to the sound of cattle lowing and horses whinnying. I sit on my porch in the evening and watch my animals grazing in the sunset. This is paradise, but surely you can understand our position. We invested our life savings in these homes." "I absolutely understand," Lisa said sympathetically. "And I'm sorry you're unhappy. But you chose to buy homes next to agricultural land. The zoning has been the same for decades. You could have researched what that meant before you invested." Robert stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out at Toro, who was taking his afternoon mud bath in the pond. "Is there anything we can do to work together on this?" Lisa joined him at the porch railing. "Well, there is one thing you could try. The county is always looking for agricultural education opportunities. Maybe Meadowbrook Estates could embrace its rural location and market itself as an agritourism community. You could advertise the authentic ranch experience as a selling point instead of trying to hide from it." Robert looked at her like she'd suggested they all move to Mars. "Think about it," Lisa continued. "City families pay good money to visit dude ranches and experience farm life. You've got the real thing right next door. You could host educational tours, teach children about agriculture, maybe even partner with local schools for field trips. Lisa, these are luxury homes. Our residents don't want educational farm tours. They want peace and quiet and property values that go up instead of down." "Well then, Robert, I'm afraid we're at an impasse. I'm not giving up my cattle operation, and you're not embracing rural life. I guess we'll just have to agree to disagree." Robert left without another word, and Lisa didn't hear from the HOA again for several weeks. But the for sale signs kept multiplying throughout Meadowbrook Estates. By the end of summer, nearly half the houses in the subdivision were on the market. The local real estate market adapted quickly to the new reality. Properties in Meadowbrook Estates were now marketed to a completely different demographic. people who actually wanted to live in the country and didn't mind the authentic sights and smells of rural life. The prices dropped significantly, but they started selling to families who appreciated the genuine agricultural setting. Lisa's favorite new neighbor was a retired veterinarian named Dr. Williams, who bought Patricia's old house at a substantial discount. Dr. Williams stopped by one evening to introduce himself and thank Lisa for maintaining such a healthy-looking herd. "I have to tell you," Dr. Williams said with a grin, "when I saw the listing mentioning nearby livestock operations, I knew this was the place for me. I spent 40 years treating farm animals, and I missed being around cattle and horses." 6 months after the livestock arrived, Lisa's phone had stopped ringing with complaints. The families who couldn't handle ranch life had moved away, replaced by people who genuinely appreciated country living. Property values in Meadowbrook Estates had stabilized at a lower but more realistic level, and the community had found its natural equilibrium. Lisa sat on her front porch one evening in late fall, watching Toro lead the herd back from the pond for their evening graze. The water was still muddy brown, and the air still carried the distinctive perfume of her cattle operation. But now her neighbors were people who understood that this was exactly what living in ranch country was supposed to be like. She raised her glass of iced tea and a toast to her beautiful, smelly, authentic piece of Texas ranch land. Sometimes the best way to solve a problem was to give people exactly what they said they wanted.